Hello everyone, Nick Jacobson. This is going to be your episode 2, following the introduction, diving in, still introducing the topic of active shooter, active threat. So let's start with that. So you hear these terms used interchangeably, active shooter and active threat. Now excuse my poor handwriting. What is the difference between these two, the active shooter and the active threat? Why do we use them interchangeably? Well, the reality is that active shooter is the traditional way we've looked at a lot of these mass killing events, because primarily we were focused on the firearm, the shooter. There's been a lot of effort over, I would say it's now pushing about 8+ years now, that law enforcement and even the federal government are really trying to push towards this statement, active threat, because it's not always a shooter, it's not always a firearm. Sometimes it's a bomb, sometimes it's knives, sometimes it's even a vehicle. The fact of the matter is what we're talking about, a individual who is actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill people in a populated area. Whether that's a school, whether that's a public event, whether that's a public location. It's not a targeted shooting where somebody's trying to get a specific individual. Now let's take note the assassination attempt on President Trump last weekend. Was that a targeted attempted killing? Yes. However, it did very much develop into an active threat event, because after the engagement of President Trump, the individual with the firearm then began engaging others in the crowd. So, fortunately, that event ended very quickly. It's very sad that we had a loss of life. These are always tragic events. And something to take note of is that throughout this series, we're going to be using very specific examples of shooting events. Examples like Sandy Hook shooting, Parkland shooting, Columbine. Many of these things may become triggering events for people. We have to talk about the specifics, though, in order to look back and think about what went wrong and what could be done better. So for those who had found themselves surviving one of these events, or the surviving families who had lost tragically their family members in one of these events, it is not meant to be a triggering event for you. It's meant to be an educational event for others so that we can learn from that loss. So with that said, let's dive back to the game scenario. You guys remember my weekly challenge I posted earlier this week to create the active threat event utilizing my board game, Follow Me the Infantry's game. So what I did is I took one of my game boards, I threw over the top of it a see-through piece of paper. This happens to be parchment paper. And I outlined more or less the shape of a classroom, because this is where we need to start. Like I said in my introduction video, we have to start in the classroom, because this is where most of us learn how to do emergency response. Okay, what is it that you do in a fire drill? What is it you do in an earthquake drill? What do you do in an active shooter, active threat drill? So we're going to start in the classroom. So within the scenario, I had the rifleman game pieces representing your students and teacher. And then we had the automatic rifleman game piece, also typically known as your squad automatic weapon, representing the shooter. And gave him the conditions that this guy has an unlimited distance and direction, that he can engage targets. They still have the same rules where they can only engage a target within their immediate area. So now, let's talk about the scenario. You're at a public school. Let's just say there is an announcement of, hey, there's a shooter, active shooter, or lockdown. The most commonly used term right now is lockdown. Remember that term. We're going to come back to this one. Lockdown. Okay. Here's a harsh reality. The vast majority of these events, when they unfold, you do not get the announcement of lockdown. What's your announcement? It's usually hearing fire alarm. Again, we're going to circle back and really dive into these two things later. Just wanted to make note of them right now. Point is that you are in your classroom. You are aware that there is an individual with a firearm, and we're going to use the scenario of firearms first. We'll eventually come back to the active threat. There's an individual with a firearm actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill people. You hear shooting, you hear screaming, you hear chaos. What are we taught to do? Currently, Majority of people in public schools are taught to go to the far end of that classroom, get down low, cover their heads, and hide and hope. Hide and hope that the police will come to save the day. So now, let's say this individual makes entry into this classroom. Are they in a good place? No. No, and that's why I created this scenario. You literally are in a terrible spot. Now, let's talk about where you ought to consider going. You hear that announcement. Let's just say it's a fire alarm, but you then know very quickly, the moment you hear the fire alarm, that there's screaming, there's chaos, there's somebody saying, hey, he's got a gun, it's a shooter. Where should you be? You should be exactly where we have taught infantry individuals to be before entering and engaging a threat on the other side of a door. You should be in what we call the stack. And you notice this is a small classroom, and this is very common and typical of many of our classrooms where you have almost 2 rows of people, or you have rows of people starting to stretch out and along. This is where you want to be, along this wall, along the wall nearest where you perceive the threat. This is where you want to be. Here's where the doorway is, because the majority of our classrooms, they have only one entry. Now, we will talk about the scenario of what if there are 2 entry points, and one end of the classroom usually leading outside and one to the inner hallways. We'll talk about that scenario. But for now, the vast majority of schools, you have one way in, one way out of those classrooms. And this is where your doorway would be. Here it comes down to, we're going to talk run, hide, fight. And I'm going to use that phrase commonly because there's some good with it. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Hide, run, fight. Got a little bit backwards there, but really doesn't matter. It's not linear. So yeah, you run, hide, fight. If you're going to be hiding, this is the best place to hide. Now, you're not really going to be hiding. You should really go away from this concept of hide. We should be going towards this understanding that you are making assessments. You're in a position of concealment. You are concealed and you're making an assessment. Where is my threat? Is he right outside the door trying to make entry? Is he down the hall engaged with something else? Is he outside and I'm better off staying where I'm at? Should I run? Should I stay? Should I fight? You and is whoever this person is at the front, they're the ones making the primary assessments because they're the ones who can get the best information. They're going to have a better idea on where that threat is versus anyone else just because of their proximity to the door. Usually this is where we would tell this is where the teacher ought to be because their students are going to be the ones following them. Not always the case in the scenario. We'll circle back to that later on, but you are making an assessment. Now, if you decide that you're going to run, again, or a scenario of one door, where's your way that you're getting out? Where are you going to be running from? It's going to be right here. Right here is where you run from. You're not running out these windows, and we'll talk that out. As many people say, oh, just go out a window. Go out this way, go out that way. We'll talk out that what if in a moment. That's not always even an available option anyway. So here we go. You're going to be running from right here. This is your place to run. And if you have to fight, we're not out looking for a fight. And that's what we teach, especially to kids. And a lot of middle schoolers really think that, and I blame video games, that they're going to go out and stop the shooter, stop them from killing their friends. Good intentions, bad information, not well applied. You're not getting into a fist fight with someone with a firearm. When we talk the fight portion, when you come up with that, you'll understand more. They're out looking, they're thinking that, but you're not doing that. You only have a fight when the fight comes to you. This individual with the threat, the firearm, enters into your space, boom, now you're in the fight. This is where the fight happens. You can't fight from back here. The fight does not happen here. The fight is right here, close. Now, many of you might be thinking at this point, yeah, that's great for an infantryman, somebody who's been taught combat and dealing with combat scenarios, but what about me? I'm just a teacher. I'm just a student. I'm just whatever you want to put in the blank. I'm not capable of doing this. I don't have the firearm. I don't have weapons training. Well, you really don't need all of that. I want to share with you a document called Army Field Manual 3-21.8. Now this is outdated. I think they have newer versions of it than this now. I want to share with you a little bit of confidence for the individual. All right, here at the very top, I'm going to start. The infantry's primary role is close combat, which can occur in any type of mission, in any theater or environment. Characterized by extreme violence and physiological shock. This is what an active shooter event is. Extreme violence and results in physiological shock. Close combat is callous and unforgiving. Its dimensions are measured in minutes and meters, and its consequences are final. Close combat stresses every aspect of physical, mental, and spiritual features of human dimension. This is something we all already know. You're an active shooter, active threat event, a terrorist event. You are being stressed to the max, and the consequences of your decisions are final. So we ought to have some tools to make the right decisions. But again, I want to give you, the individual, a little piece of confidence. Look here, the infantry. Of all branches of the U.S. Army, the infantry is unique because its core competency is founded on the individual soldier, the infantry rifleman. While other branches tend to focus on weapon systems, your firearms, your big guns, your mortars, weapon systems, and platforms to accomplish their mission, the infantry alone relies almost exclusively on the human dimension. The human dimension. You are the human dimension. It's not what weapon you have. Those are tools, and there are benefits to it. One thing you'll never hear me advocate is for placing of firearms in a public school. I'll talk more about that later on, but the bottom line up front with that is the majority of firearms-related incidents in schools are factually and unfortunately people who had the legal right to have a firearm there, primarily law enforcement, having what I call a negligent discharge of their firearm. That means they did not intend for it to go off, but the firearm went off. And I can give you hundreds, maybe even thousands now of examples of where a firearm that was lawfully there went off when it shouldn't have. Again, I call it negligence. I don't call it accidental. You know, when you're an individual who's supposed to be an expert and professional with this, there are no accidents. There's negligence. But that doesn't matter. You don't need a firearm. And you might not have a firearm with you. Even if you have a firearm, that firearm might fail. And when that firearm fails, is your fight over? You just give up? No, you don't give up. You are that human dimension. Remember that. When we go through this conversation, we're going to be talking about you, the human dimension. In our next video, we're actually going to take a huge jump backwards in time and start looking at history of response. So that's what you can expect in our next video, history. Because we have to see where we came from first in order to understand why we're making a change and going to this. This is the bottom line up front. This is where you need to be.